The courtroom is silent, so silent that the faint hum of the fluorescent light sounds like thunder. Every eye in the gallery is locked on the defendant, a 17-year-old girl with trembling hands and a stare that's not remorseful, not defiant, just empty. She looks impossibly small in the sea of dark suits and uniformed officers, her school-issued sweater hanging loosely from shoulders that still carry the shape of adolescence. Across the aisle, 3 framed photographs rest on a table draped in white cloth, a mother, a father, and their teenage son. Their smiles, frozen in the amber of better days, seem to watch the girl who took their place in the world with quiet disbelief. The judge clears his throat. He's delivered thousands of sentences, but this one weighs heavier than most. "Life in prison," he says, his voice echoing through the chamber like the final toll of a bell. The girl's knees buckle. A sound escapes her, half gasp, half sob, but it's the mother's cry from the victim's row that splits the air open. Flashbulbs pop. Somewhere in the back, a reporter whispers, 17 years old. As deputies move to escort her away, the girl turns her head just once, toward the lone figure sitting apart from everyone else. A boy with tear-streaked cheeks, hands gripping the wooden bench so hard his knuckles have turned white. Her boyfriend, the only surviving member of the family she destroyed. For a moment, their eyes meet, 2 ghosts from the same tragedy, bound together by a secret that no one else in the room will ever fully understand. And then, as the courtroom doors close behind her, the story of how a teenage romance turned into a nightmare begins to unravel. A story of jealousy, manipulation, and a night that left an entire community asking one impossible question: how could love turn into something this monstrous? Before the blood and headlines, before the cameras and courtroom tears, the world of the Haydens looked almost painfully ordinary. The Hayden home sat on a quiet cul-de-sac in Maple Ridge, a small suburban pocket where the biggest excitement was the annual block party and the sound of lawnmowers signaled Saturday morning. The family's 2-story house, trimmed in white and pale blue, stood beneath an old maple tree, whose branches scattered gold leaves across the driveway every fall. Inside, the air always carried a faint warmth, fresh coffee in the mornings, the buttery smell of dinner rolls in the evenings, and laughter that echoed from room to room like a living heartbeat. David Hayden was a high school counselor, the kind of man students trusted with secrets they couldn't share at home. His wife Marianne taught English at the same school. Together they'd built a life centered on community and kindness, bake sales, volunteer shifts at the food pantry, weekend movie nights. Their 16-year-old son Ethan inherited that gentle steadiness. He played guitar, wore sneakers scribbled with doodles, and never missed a chance to hold the door open for someone. When their older son, Liam, left for college, the family dynamic shifted, but stayed close. David often said, "The quiet feels bigger without him." But it's a good kind of quiet. In photos, their smiles were easy, natural, unguarded, the kind of happiness that never thinks it needs protecting. Across town, 17-year-old Amber Kerrigan lived in a smaller, more chaotic world. Her family moved frequently. Her mother juggled 2 jobs, and her father was mostly a rumor, a name that flickered through phone calls and broken promises. Amber grew up learning to adapt, to be charming, to read moods, to make herself indispensable to anyone who could fill the gaps her parents left behind. She was bright, magnetic, and lonely in ways no one noticed. When Amber met Ethan Hayden at a spring music festival, she didn't see just a boy strumming a guitar. She saw everything she'd never had: stability, safety, belonging. Ethan saw something too, a spark, a rush of energy that pulled him out of his quiet comfort zone. Their connection was instant, the kind of teenage whirlwind that feels like destiny before it proves to be disaster. That summer, the 2 were inseparable. Drives along country roads with the windows down, shared milkshakes at the diner, late-night texts that bled into sunrise. To their classmates, they were the picture of young love, the counselor's son and the new girl with restless eyes. Even David and Marianne smiled at the thought. Amber was polite, funny, even helpful with dishes when she came over for dinner. But there was a tension hidden in those perfect scenes, a subtle possessiveness that lived just beneath Amber's soft laugh, a flicker of fear whenever Ethan didn't text back fast enough. Small moments easily dismissed. Still, if you looked closely, there were tiny cracks forming in the glossy surface of the Hayden family's peace. because behind Amber's bright smile and Ethan's trusting eyes, something darker was already taking root, a quiet dependency, an obsession disguised as love. The Hayden home would stay warm and full of laughter a little while longer. Then one night, that warmth would turn to smoke. To everyone who saw them together, Ethan and Amber looked like something out of a movie. He was the easygoing boy next door with a patient smile. She was the lively new girl who turned heads and laughed too loud. Teachers teased them good-naturedly about being joined at the hip. On social media, their photos told a perfect story. Matching hoodies, inside jokes in captions, the kind of teenage love that made other couples feel small by comparison. In the hallways of Maple Ridge High, Amber was radiant. She volunteered at pep rallies, brought homemade cookies to class, and always remembered birthdays. She had that magnetic charm that made teachers adore her and peers want to be near her. To David and Marianne Hayden, she was a welcome presence in their son's world, a girl who seemed to soften his shyness and make him laugh more easily. But those closest to Ethan began noticing something quieter, something unsettling that hid behind the smiles. When friends invited him out, he'd check his phone first. "Amber doesn't really like parties," he'd say, "or she gets anxious when I don't text." When he spoke about her, it was with careful phrasing, as if every word was a thread in a fragile web he couldn't afford to break. Amber's charm in public masked a deep insecurity in private. She demanded reassurance constantly. Where Ethan was, who he was with, what he was thinking. A text unanswered for more than 10 minutes could spiral into a dozen calls. Her words were sugary but edged with threat. "I just love you so much. You'd tell me if someone else was trying to take you away, right?" At first, Ethan interpreted it as passion, a kind of fierce devotion. But love slowly began to feel like surveillance. Amber had memorized his class schedule, his lunch period, even the sound of his guitar through the phone speaker. When he didn't pick up, she'd show up at his doorstep, smile bright as ever, apology rehearsed. "I just missed you." The Haydens saw pieces of the truth, but not the whole picture. Marianne sometimes joked that young love was intense like weather, stormy but it passes. She didn't realize how literal that would become. Amber's private life told a darker story. Her mother's long shifts left her alone for days. The small apartment was quiet except for the television and the buzz of her phone. Ethan's messages were the only light in the dark. Each response was proof she existed in someone's mind. Each silence felt like death. That kind of hunger doesn't vanish. It mutates. By fall, their relationship had transformed into something symbiotic and suffocating. Ethan's grades slipped. His friends drifted away. He stopped practicing guitar. The same people who once envied their closeness now whispered about how he flinched whenever his phone lit up. Still, the Haydens' kindness never wavered. They invited Amber to Thanksgiving dinner, joked about her becoming part of the family someday, and Amber smiled, polite and grateful. But somewhere behind those wide brown eyes, a thought was taking shape. That this family wasn't just something she admired. It was something she deserved, and if anyone tried to take it from her, even the people who owned it, she would make sure they couldn't. It began on a Friday evening that looked, from the outside, like any other in Maple Ridge. The sun was sinking behind the rooftops, painting the street in the soft copper light that made the neighborhood seem almost unreal, frozen in a perfect calm. Inside the Hayden home, the smell of dinner still hung in the air. A movie played quietly in the living room. It was the sort of night that should have disappeared into memory as something warm and ordinary. Ethan had promised Amber he'd stop by after dinner. Lately, their arguments had grown sharp and unpredictable, like lightning in a clear sky. But he'd convinced himself that talking in person would calm her down. She'd been texting all afternoon, first pleading, then accusing, then silent. The silence worried him most. At 9:13 p.m., he slipped on his hoodie, told his parents he was heading out for a short drive, and left. He didn't notice the figure already watching from across the street, the flicker of headlights off a small silver car parked half a block away. Amber Kerrigan hadn't been invited over that night. She had already been waiting there for hours. According to later evidence, she'd come armed, not with a plan that made sense, but with rage sharpened by days of jealousy and the conviction that she was about to lose everything that tethered her to the world. She'd convinced herself that Ethan's parents were poisoning him against her, that they looked down on her, that they wanted her gone. In her mind, she wasn't the intruder. She was the victim. When the Haydens' front doorbell rang just after 9:30, Marianne answered it with the polite warmth she always showed the girl who'd shared so many dinners at their table. Amber's smile was trembling. "Is Ethan here?" she asked. Marianne shook her head gently. He'd just gone out. She started to say he'd be back soon, but the words never finished forming. The scream that followed would wake half the street. Neighbors later said it sounded like a car crash. The sound of wood splintering, a body hitting the floor, then another cry, short, choked, and final. David Hayden rushed from the den. What he saw froze him in place. Amber stood in the foyer, her hands shaking, a kitchen knife glinting under the porch light. Blood ran in uneven lines across the tile. Marianne lay motionless. For a moment, neither of them moved. "Amber," David started, but she lunged. The details after that were reconstructed from evidence. The overturned chair, the shattered picture frame, the trail of footprints leading toward the back hallway. It lasted less than 2 minutes. 2 minutes that erased 17 years of innocence and an entire family's sense of safety. When Ethan returned home around 9:45, police sirens were already slicing through the quiet. The front door was wide open. Red and blue light flickered across the white siding of the house. He stumbled toward the officers, shouting his parents' names, but the only words that reached him were from a paramedic. "Son, you can't go in there. Behind the tape." His world had collapsed into chaos. Paramedics bent over 2 still forms. And in the middle of it all, Amber Kerrigan sitting on the floor, her hands covered in blood, whispering over and over, "I didn't mean to. They were trying to take him from me." In that moment, the girl he'd once loved and the life he'd known both ceased to exist. The news of the Hayden murders hit Maple Ridge like an earthquake in a town built on glass. Nothing about the Haydens fit the narrative of violence. No history of trouble, no secrets to unravel, no warning signs anyone could name. They were the people who sent birthday cards to neighbors, who offered rides to stranded students after practice, who left the porch light on for everyone. By dawn, the house had become a crime scene sealed behind yellow tape, the driveway flooded with flashing lights. Reporters crowded the sidewalk, their whispers mixing with the low hum of police radios. Across the street, neighbors stood wrapped in blankets, faces pale and stunned, clutching mugs of coffee they'd never drink. Someone left flowers by the mailbox before sunrise. By afternoon, there were dozens. Inside the Hayden home, investigators worked in silence, photographing overturned furniture, gathering DNA samples, tagging evidence. Every movement felt intrusive, like dissecting something sacred. The kitchen, once full of laughter, was now the epicenter of unspeakable violence. The smell of cleaning chemicals couldn't mask the metallic tang in the air. At Maple Ridge High, classes were suspended. Grief counselors filled the library. Students gathered in circles, crying quietly into their sleeves, staring at photos of Ethan and his parents on their phones, unable to process that the smiling faces they saw every day in the hallways were gone. And then came the second shock, the suspect's name. When news broke that the killer was not a stranger, but Amber Kerrigan, the girl everyone had admired, disbelief turned to hysteria. Teachers couldn't reconcile the bright student who'd volunteered at the literacy drive with the teenager in handcuffs on the evening news. In the days that followed, Maple Ridge divided itself into 2 kinds of grief, one for the victims and one for the illusion shattered by their killer. Parents whispered to each other in grocery aisles, "How could a girl like that do something like this?" as if saying it aloud might make it less real. For Ethan, who had been taken into protective custody that night, there were no words big enough to contain the loss. He'd gone from having a family to being the only survivor of it. The memories came in flashes, his father's laugh, the smell of his mother's cooking, Amber's voice saying she loved him. They twisted together until he couldn't tell love from horror anymore. At the police station, while officers moved through the motions of paperwork and evidence logging, he sat in silence, wrapped in a blanket that didn't warm him. When detectives gently asked if he wanted to talk, he shook his head. "I just want to know why," he whispered. Outside, the town turned his tragedy into headlines. Teen love turns deadly. Jealous rage destroys family. The girl next door with blood on her hands. But inside the station, it was quieter, just a 17-year-old boy staring at his own trembling hands, realizing that the person he loved most in the world had destroyed everything he'd ever known. And across the hallway, behind a locked door, Amber Kerrigan sat under fluorescent light, her eyes empty and unfocused, repeating a single phrase to anyone who would listen. "I didn't mean to. They made me do it." The first 48 hours of any homicide are chaos. Flashes of information, conflicting witness accounts, too many threads to pull at once. For the detectives assigned to the Hayden case, that chaos came with one additional complication: the suspect's story. Amber Kerrigan's confession, if it could be called that, was fragmented, inconsistent, soaked in tears. In her first interview, she insisted she hadn't hurt anyone. "I just wanted to talk to them," she told Detective Marquez, her voice breaking. "They were yelling. They said I wasn't good enough for him. I don't remember what happened after that." She clung to the same line, looping it endlessly, her words blurring together through sobs and exhaustion. She painted a picture of an argument that escalated out of control. Not a calculated attack, but a tragic misunderstanding. And at first, it almost worked. There were no forced entry marks. She'd been invited into that house before. Her fingerprints belonged there. The knife she'd used came from the Hayden's own kitchen. Her wounds were superficial, small cuts across her hands and wrists that could easily be mistaken for defensive. To a casual glance, it could have looked like a scuffle gone wrong. Detectives pieced together her timeline and found gaps wide enough to drown in. She claimed she'd gone over to reconcile with Ethan's parents, that things just got out of hand. The story tugged at a universal instinct, to believe that a teenager couldn't possibly plan something this brutal. In the early days, the press framed it the same way. Tragic fight between teen and boyfriend's family. The headlines softened the reality, painting Amber as a fragile girl lost in emotion rather than a killer acting on obsession. Online, sympathy poured in. Classmates flooded social media with old photos. Amber laughing at lunch. Amber volunteering at the school carnival, with captions like, "There must be more to the story." The narrative of the good girl who snapped spread like wildfire. Even some investigators weren't immune. Detective Marquez wrote in his notes, "Possible heat-of-the-moment homicide. Emotional instability. Check psych eval." But as the forensics team began processing the evidence, that fragile story started to crack. There were details that didn't fit the image of a panicked, defensive struggle, things too deliberate, too controlled. In the crime lab, a technician flagged something strange, blood patterns that didn't match Amber's account. The angle of impact, the distance between stains, they told a different story. One of movement, of pursuit. Amber hadn't been attacked. She had been chasing. When the results came back, they revealed what no one wanted to believe, that the first blow had landed before any argument could have possibly taken place. The illusion of a fight gone wrong began to dissolve, piece by piece. But what replaced it was far more chilling, the possibility that this wasn't an accident at all, but a planned, purposeful act of annihilation. And as detectives dug deeper into Amber's life, they would soon find that the truth wasn't just darker than they imagined. It was carefully hidden behind a mask of innocence that had fooled everyone, including Ethan. The first real break in the case came quietly, almost by accident. 3 days after the murders, Detective Marquez sat in his unlit office, flipping through the crime scene photographs for what felt like the 100th time. Each image told the same story of chaos: overturned furniture, shattered glass, a family destroyed. But it was one small detail in the corner of a photo that caught his attention. A sliver of light, reflecting off something metallic near the baseboard of the hallway. He sent the image to forensics. The next morning, the report came back. It was a phone, Amber's phone. It had been wedged beneath a cabinet, half hidden in a shadow where no one would have thought to look. The device had been partially wiped, its call log deleted but not completely. Within hours, the digital forensics team began pulling fragments of data from its memory. What they uncovered shifted the entire course of the investigation. Amber hadn't gone to the Hayden house unannounced. She'd been tracking Ethan. Her search history showed obsessive patterns stretching back months, GPS lookups of his school schedule, his parents' work hours, even their home Wi-Fi network's login. There were screenshots of his social media messages, notes written like diary entries. He's lying again. They're turning him against me. If I can't have him, no one will. More chilling were the text messages recovered between Amber and an anonymous number labeled J. At first, they appeared mundane, small talk, gossip, complaints about school. But as detectives read further, the tone shifted. They're keeping him from me. He says he needs space, but I know it's them. I swear, they'll make them listen. The last text was time-stamped 9:12 p.m., the exact minute Ethan left his house that night. It's happening tonight. Forensic. Analysts also discovered that Amber had been searching for painless ways to die and how to clean. Blood from clothing in the days leading up to the attack. Yet alongside those dark searches were online shopping records for makeup, jewelry, and travel bags. Evidence of someone living two lives, one building an image, the other planning its destruction. Detectives also processed her car, a compact silver sedan parked a few blocks from the crime scene. Under the back seat, they found a set of clothes sealed in a plastic grocery bag, a dark hoodie, black jeans, and gloves still tacky with dried blood. DNA testing confirmed what everyone feared. The blood matched both Marianne and David Hayden. There was no longer any doubt. This wasn't a confrontation gone wrong. This was premeditation. The turning point came when the lab retrieved the final piece of data from Amber's phone, a short voice memo saved automatically by her messaging app, accidentally recorded in the background at 9:31 p.m., just minutes before the 911 call. The file was under 2 minutes long, and most of it was muffled sound, footsteps, a door creaking, someone whispering something unintelligible. But near the end came a voice, low and trembling, unmistakably Amber's. "You shouldn't have done that, Mrs. Hayden. You shouldn't have said that." Then came a thud. A scream. Silence. When Detective Marquez played it for the first time, the entire room froze. It wasn't just evidence. It was a window into the moment the mask slipped. A glimpse of the quiet, deliberate rage that had been hiding behind a young girl's smile. The press never heard about the recording, at least not yet. But inside the precinct, everyone knew the narrative of a teenage outburst was dead. What they had now was the profile of a predator, a 17-year-old who had planned every step of a massacre, right down to the performance that would follow it. The investigation had crossed a threshold. The truth was no longer a question of if. It was now a matter of why. The interrogation room was cold, sterile, and windowless, a square of concrete painted in the color of exhaustion. The kind of room where truth never arrived easily. Amber Kerrigan sat in a metal chair, her wrists cuffed loosely in front of her. The bruises from that night had faded into faint yellow smudges along her forearms, but her eyes carried a different kind of wound, one that didn't heal. She stared at the mirrored wall, her reflection a stranger. Detective Marquez entered quietly, a thick folder in his hands. He set it down on the table, the sound sharp in the stillness. "How are you feeling today, Amber?" She didn't answer. Her eyes flicked toward him, then away. "You've had a few days to rest," he continued, his tone gentle, almost kind. "You must be exhausted. Everything that's happened. It's a lot for anyone to process." Amber exhaled slowly. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she murmured, her voice trembling. "They were yelling. I just wanted them to stop." Marquez nodded as if he believed her. He opened the folder, laying out photographs, not the gory ones, but still images of the house, the kitchen table, the family's framed photos on the wall. "You spent a lot of time there," he said softly. "You knew where everything was, where they kept the knives, the back door code." Amber's face twitched. "They trusted me," she said, barely audible. "That's what I'm trying to understand," Marquez replied. "They trusted you. And you cared about Ethan, didn't you?" Her eyes flickered, the first real emotion he'd seen. "He loved me," she said. Marquez leaned back. "He did. I think he still does in some way." Amber looked up, a faint spark of pride softening her posture. "He does," she said. "He just doesn't know it right now." Marquez let the silence stretch. Then he pulled out his phone, placed it gently on the table and pressed play. The recording from her own phone filled the room, a whisper, a thud, a scream. Amber froze. Her pupils widened, her breathing quickened. For a moment she looked like a trapped animal. "You shouldn't have done that. Mrs. Hayden," her own voice echoed, metallic and hollow. Then silence. Marquez let the moment hang in the air before he spoke. "That's you, Amber, your voice. The timestamp puts it at 9:31 p.m. That's before the 911 call." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. He didn't press. Not yet. Instead, he softened his tone again. "Help me understand. What did she say to you that made you so angry?" Amber's shoulders began to tremble. "She said I was ruining his life," she whispered. "She said I was manipulating him. That I was dangerous, were you?" Amber's eyes lifted. "No," she said, her voice rising. "She didn't understand us." "None of them did. They kept turning him against me. They told him I was unstable, that he should leave me. And you couldn't let that happen." Her jaw tightened. "He was mine." The word hung in the air like smoke, possessive, brittle, final. Marquez leaned forward, his voice low. "Did you plan it, Amber?" Her fingers twitched against the table. "No," she said too quickly. "I just wanted to talk. To make them listen. Then why did you wear gloves?" Her eyes flicked to him. "Why did you search online for how to clean blood from clothes?" The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Amber's breathing grew shallow. "I didn't—" Marquez slid a photograph across the table. The grocery bag found in her car, the gloves, the dark hoodie. "You brought these with you," he said quietly. "That's not something people do by accident." Amber's expression cracked. For the first time, the mask of sorrow slipped, revealing something colder underneath. Her voice flattened. "You don't understand. They made me." "Made you what?" She leaned forward, her cuffed hands trembling. "They made me choose. Him or them. And you chose him," Marquez said. Her silence was answer enough. He stood, gathering his folder. "You know what the hardest part of this is, Amber," he said, his tone soft but edged with steel. "You could have walked away. You could have chosen to live, but you didn't want peace. You wanted control." He turned toward the door. Amber's voice, quiet but venomous, stopped him. "You think you know me," she whispered. "But you don't. You think I'm a monster. But I did it for love." Marquez paused, hand on the door handle, his reflection meeting hers in the mirror. "No," he said. "You did it for yourself." The door closed behind him with a sound that echoed like the end of a confession. It took weeks for the truth to emerge, not because Amber was clever, but because she'd built her life like a stage set, perfect from the front, hollow behind the curtain. She wasn't just a jealous girlfriend. She was an actress living a role, one that had fooled almost everyone, including Ethan. The image she'd crafted was flawless. The model student, the volunteer, the smiling neighbor who remembered birthdays and baked cookies for the block party. But beneath the sweetness was a current of rot that no one had ever looked closely enough to see. Detectives traced her digital life, texts, private accounts, anonymous forums, and uncovered the real Amber Kerrigan, a girl who thrived on control. She kept screenshots of Ethan's messages, notes cataloging every conversation they'd had, even timestamps of when he last viewed her stories. It wasn't affection. It was surveillance. The motive, when it came into focus, was as simple as it was horrifying: possession. When Ethan started pulling away that summer, Amber's world began to collapse. His parents had noticed her volatility, the late-night calls, the outbursts at school, the way she showed up unannounced. They'd gently told their son that he needed space, that this relationship wasn't healthy. Amber overheard one of those conversations. From that day on, everything she did, every fake smile, every tear, was leading toward that night. Detectives found a private journal in her bedroom, tucked inside a geometry notebook. The entries weren't confessions. They were manifestos. June 3rd. He says they want him to stop seeing me. They think I'm a problem. I'll show them what a problem really looks like. June 17th. They'll regret making him choose. June 21st. They don't understand that love doesn't go away. Love fights back. In between these notes were sketches, hearts drawn over Ethan's name, but also dark shapes, jagged lines that looked like knives. It was the mind of someone who'd confused devotion with domination, but the double life went even deeper. Investigators learned that Amber had been messaging another boy online, a classmate named Ryan, someone she'd met in a summer program months earlier. The messages were flirtatious at first, but quickly turned manipulative. She told Ryan she was being abused at home, that Ethan's parents were trying to ruin her life. She spun a tragic fiction in which she was the victim of a cruel family trying to keep her from true love. Ryan had believed her. He'd even offered to scare them, but Amber didn't need him for that. She wanted something purer, the satisfaction of doing it herself. Prosecutors would later describe it as a cocktail of obsession and control, the psychology of someone who couldn't exist without being adored. The idea of rejection, from Ethan, from his parents, was intolerable. If she couldn't have their approval, she'd destroy them instead. And yet, the most chilling detail came not from her digital footprint, but from what was missing. In her closet, detectives found a packed duffel bag, clothes, cash, a fake ID, and a one-way bus ticket to Chicago dated June 23rd, the morning after the murders. She hadn't planned to die that night. She'd planned to disappear. In her warped vision, the act of violence wasn't an end, it was a beginning. A new life born from ashes, a version of herself untethered from judgment, from guilt from Ethan's family. But her fantasy had crumbled the moment Ethan had survived. Forensic psychologists would later testify that Amber's mind fit the profile of what they called reactive narcissistic rage, a blend of emotional immaturity, abandonment trauma, and pathological entitlement. She didn't lash out because she lost control. She lashed out to regain it. The prosecution had what they needed, a motive anchored not in passion, but in possession, and a pattern of manipulation so deep it bordered on psychosis. What they didn't yet have was proof that Amber had intended to kill everyone in that house. That they would find in the most unexpected place of all, her own voice, spoken weeks earlier, to a friend who thought she was just venting teenage anger. By the time the trial date was set, the name Amber Kerrigan had become both a fascination and a warning. In the months since her arrest, the case had transformed from tragedy to spectacle. Local stations aired nightly retrospectives. True crime podcasts dissected her every word. To the public, she wasn't just a teenager anymore. She was a symbol, a riddle of beauty and brutality that people couldn't stop staring at. And Amber loved it. In jail, she adjusted to her new audience with unsettling ease. She spent hours writing letters, dozens of them, to classmates, reporters, even strangers who'd sent her mail. She signed each one with looping, girlish handwriting and phrases like, "Don't believe everything they say about me." She practiced her smiles in the mirror. She perfected the quiver in her voice. She was rehearsing for her next performance, the courtroom. When the trial began that autumn, the courthouse was surrounded by news vans and satellite dishes. Inside, the atmosphere felt more like a premiere than a proceeding. Rows of spectators filled every seat, journalists scribbling notes as if documenting a play. Amber's defense team, led by public defender Martin Croft, built their strategy on one word: emotion. They painted her as a fragile, traumatized girl, a victim of neglect and mental illness pushed beyond reason. They argued that her actions were not premeditated murder, but the tragic consequence of untreated emotional instability. Croft's opening statement was soft, almost poetic. He described a young woman lost in the storm of first love, manipulated by fear and desperation. She didn't go there to kill, he told the jury. She went there to be heard. Across the aisle, the prosecution's lead attorney, Sarah Lindholm, offered no theatrics. Her opening was quiet, surgical, devastating. "This case," she began, "is not about love. It's about control." Then she clicked a remote. The screen behind her lit up with a still image from the Hayden's home security camera. Amber standing in the foyer, a knife glinting in her hand. The jurors shifted in their seats. The room fell silent. Ethan sat in the gallery with his brother, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned white. He hadn't seen her since the night of the attack. When she entered the courtroom, dressed in soft blue, hair pulled back neatly, he barely recognized her. She looked like the girl he used to know, the girl who smiled in summer sunlight, who sang off-key in his car. But her eyes were different, empty. The trial unfolded like theater. Each day Amber arrived calm and polished, her demeanor carefully curated. When the judge entered, she stood with perfect posture. When the jury filed in, she smiled politely. She cried at precisely the right moments, when her lawyer described her traumatic upbringing, when photos of the Haydens were shown. But her tears were dry, her eyes unblinking. It was all choreography. Even her wardrobe had been calculated. Gone were the black clothes she'd worn in her mugshot. In their place, soft sweaters, pale colors, Minimal makeup, an image of innocence meticulously sculpted. Reporters noted how she would sometimes look toward Ethan in the audience, her expression soft, almost pleading, as if silently asking for forgiveness she didn't mean. He never looked back. The prosecution, however, was relentless. They dismantled the image piece by piece, showing the phone data, the journal, the packed bag, the recording. Each exhibit chipped away at the performance until the mask began to crack. The tension in the courtroom grew with every testimony. Detectives spoke of her calculated movements. Forensic analysts described the deliberate steps taken to conceal evidence. Psychologists outlined the profile of an individual who viewed love as possession, empathy as weakness. But Amber's defense wasn't finished. They had one more move, one that could, if it worked, shift the emotional balance back in her favor. They would put Amber herself on the stand. It was a gamble as old as the courtroom itself. Let the accused speak, humanize her, draw sympathy. Her lawyer believed her charm would sway at least one juror. The prosecution, meanwhile, prepared for what they knew was coming. They had one final weapon waiting, a revelation so devastating it would pierce through every lie Amber had ever told. For now, the stage was set, the audience waited, and Amber Kerrigan, 17 years old and utterly convinced of her own brilliance, straightened her sweater, practiced her trembling voice, and prepared for her greatest role yet, her own redemption story. The courtroom was silent, heavy with anticipation, when Amber Kerrigan took the stand. Her voice at first was soft, almost trembling, each syllable carefully measured to sound fragile. Her attorney guided her gently through rehearsed questions, her childhood, her loneliness, her love for Ethan. The story flowed like something written for sympathy, a girl abandoned by the world, misunderstood by everyone except the boy she loved. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she said, her eyes glassy with well-practiced tears. "I just wanted them to listen. They wouldn't stop yelling. I got scared." A few jurors nodded, their expressions uneasy but open. She could feel it, the slow shifting current of empathy. It was working. Then it was the prosecution's turn. Sarah Lindholm rose from her seat, a single sheet of paper in her hand. Her tone was calm, but her gaze was unflinching. "Ms. Kerrigan," she began, "you've told this court you didn't plan what happened that night. That it was spontaneous?" Amber nodded faintly. "No planning? No intention to harm anyone?" "No, I swear." Lindholm held up the paper. "This is a transcript of a text message you sent 1 week before the attack. Can you read the highlighted line aloud?" Amber hesitated. The courtroom leaned forward. Slowly she read it. "If they keep trying to take him from me, I'll make sure they can't." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Ethan bowed his head. Amber's lawyer objected, claiming it was emotional interpretation. Overruled. Lindholm continued, her voice growing colder. "You've also testified that you didn't know how the Hayden security system worked, yet you disabled the Wi-Fi router before entering the home. How did you know to do that?" Amber's mouth opened, then closed. I panicked. I just grabbed the right wire on the first try." Lindholm interrupted gently. "That's impressive presence of mind for someone in a panic." The jury watched her closely now, their sympathy thinning. Lindholm let the silence settle before she placed her final exhibit on the podium, a small USB drive. The prosecution would like to play a short audio clip recovered from the defendant's phone, time-stamped 4 days before the murders. Amber's face drained of color. The courtroom speakers crackled. At first only static, then Amber's voice, calm, confident, recorded during a private conversation with her friend Ryan. "They think they can scare me, but they don't know who they're dealing with. If they get in the way again, I'll handle it. They'll be sorry." The words weren't screamed in anger. They were deliberate, icy, controlled. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward her. Amber's composure cracked. "That's out of context," she said quickly, her voice rising. "You're twisting what I said." Lindholm took a slow step forward. "What's the context, Miss Kerrigan? What would make a 17-year-old say something like that about her boyfriend's parents?" Amber's breathing grew uneven. "You're lying!" "They hated me. Did they deserve to die?" Her outburst came before she could stop it. Sharp, loud roar. "They deserved what they got." Her gasps erupted across the courtroom. Ethan flinched as if struck. Amber's own lawyer froze, his expression pale. For a moment the room was utterly still, every breath, every whisper suspended in the thick air of realization. Lindholm didn't speak. She didn't have to. Amber's face crumpled as she realized what she'd said. "I didn't mean that," she stammered. "You don't understand. They made me, but the damage was irreversible." The mask of the victim had shattered in front of everyone. The charming girl, the frightened teenager, the misunderstood lover seems gone. What remained was the naked truth, the cold entitlement, the unfiltered venom of someone who believed her own pain justified cruelty. The judge struck the gavel, calling for order, but the trial had already turned. Jurors who had once looked at her with pity now stared with quiet horror. The illusion had finally collapsed. Amber slumped in her chair, her expression flickering between rage and disbelief. She'd spent months perfecting her performance, only to destroy it with one unguarded sentence. As court adjourned for the day, Ethan rose slowly, his eyes fixed on her for the first time since that night. Their gaze met, a fleeting, silent collision of everything that had been lost, and for the first time Amber looked away. He finally turned toward Amber. His voice didn't rise. "It didn't need to. You looked my mother in the eyes before you killed her. You took away my dad, my home, my family. And you said it was because you loved me. But that wasn't love. It was ownership. It was selfishness. And now you get to live with that." He stepped back, his expression unreadable. Not rage, not forgiveness. Just the hollow space where both used to live. Next came Ethan Hayden, the older brother who had been away at college the night it happened. His words were quieter, more measured, but cut just as deep. "I used to feel guilty for not being there. I thought maybe I could have stopped it if I'd come home sooner. But now I know people like her don't get stopped. They only get caught." He looked toward Amber, his voice shaking with anger held barely in check. "You took from us something you can't replace. You took my parents' kindness, and you mocked it. You took my brother's innocence, and turned it into nightmares. You destroyed a family because you couldn't stand being told no." Amber sat motionless, eyes glassy, her face an unreadable mask. The final voice belonged to Ethan Hayden, David's mother, the family's quiet matriarch, her silver hair neatly pinned. Her hands clutching a folded piece of paper she never once looked at. When she spoke, her voice was frail but unbroken. "I raised a son who believed in forgiveness," she said. "He believed that everyone deserves a chance to be better. And I want to honor that. But I can't forgive what you've done. Because forgiveness means letting go, and I will never let go of my boy or his wife." Her voice trembled, but her words were steel. "You took two people who spent their lives helping others, and you gave nothing back but pain. You left my grandson with memories he will never escape. You've stolen birthdays, holidays, and quiet mornings we'll never get again." Then she turned to face Amber directly. The room held its breath. "I hope someday when you are sitting in that cell you understand what love really means. It's not control. It's sacrifice. And you don't know either." The silence that followed was thick and sacred, the kind that no one dared break. Amber's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, whispering to her to remain composed. But for the first time her mask slipped not into anger, but into something else. Not remorse, something colder. Emptiness. When the judge finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of finality. "This court acknowledges the pain expressed here today. It cannot be undone. But it will be remembered." He called for recess before sentencing. The jurors sat frozen, their eyes rimmed red. The families clutched one another. The deputies escorted Amber back to holding, her footsteps echoing in the hallway. And for those who remained, the silence left behind was its own kind of verdict, a recognition that justice, no matter how thorough, can never restore what obsession took away. The courtroom was nearly silent when the jury returned. 12 faces, pale with exhaustion and burdened with truth, filed in one by one. Their expressions told the story before the foreman even spoke, the solemn heaviness that follows certainty, not doubt. Amber Kerrigan sat motionless beside her attorney, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The soft blue sweater she'd worn throughout the trial was slightly wrinkled now, her composure fraying at the edges. But she still carried herself with the same eerie calm that had haunted every witness, as if the rules of reality didn't fully apply to her. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreman stood, voice trembling slightly. "We have, Your Honor." He handed over the paper. The judge scanned it, then read aloud. On the charge of first-degree murder of Marianne Hayden. Guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder of David Hayden. Guilty. On the charge of attempted murder of Ethan Hayden. Guilty. The words fell like stones in water, ripples of silence spreading through the room. A single sob escaped from the gallery. Ethan exhaled shakily, his eyes closing as if bracing for something he'd been holding off for months. Amber didn't move. No tears, no anger. Just a faint smirk flickering for a fraction of a second, gone before most noticed it, but not before Ethan did. The judge thanked the jury, excused them, and turned to address the defendant. Miss Kerrigan, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers. Sentencing will proceed immediately. Amber's attorney rose for one final appeal, his tone weary. Your Honor, the defense requests leniency in light of the defendant's age. Ms. Kerrigan was 17 at the time of the crime. Impulsive, emotionally unstable, and suffering from untreated psychological disorders. We asked the court to consider the possibility of rehabilitation. The judge's gaze was steady. Mr. Croft, the court acknowledges her age, but youth is not an absolution. It is a responsibility, one she weaponized to exploit trust and compassion. He turned to Amber. Do you have anything to say before sentencing? For a long moment she said nothing. Then she rose slowly, facing the court. Her expression was calm, almost serene. Everyone keeps talking about me like I'm a monster, she began. Like I just woke up one day and decided to destroy everything. But none of you understand what it feels like to be invisible. To love someone so much that it consumes you, and to have them taken away. Her voice trembled, not with sorrow, but with frustration. I didn't mean for it to go that far. I just wanted to be heard. They pushed me. They made me do it. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Disbelief, disgust, pity. Ethan stared at her, not with anger anymore, but with something far colder. Clarity. He'd finally realized there would never be remorse. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done, only sorry she hadn't gotten away with it. The judge exhaled, the weight of his duty pressing visibly upon him. He adjusted his glasses, his voice low but resolute. Amber Kerrigan, the evidence in this case reveals premeditation, manipulation, and a profound absence of empathy. You were 17 when you committed these acts, old enough to understand their consequences, yet young enough to believe you could escape them. This court will ensure that you do not. He paused, letting the gravity of his words settle. You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 40 years. The gavel struck once, echoing through the room like a closing door. Amber blinked, her face blank, no tears, no outburst. Just stillness. Then slowly she turned her head toward the gallery. Her eyes met Ethan's for one final time. And that faint smirk, the same one from the night of the murders, the same that had haunted his nightmares, returned. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it carried all the defiance in the world. As deputies led her away, her voice carried softly over the silence. You'll think of me every day, she said, her tone almost tender. Ethan didn't respond. He didn't have to, because in that moment, he understood something she never would. Remembering her wasn't the same as belonging to her. When the doors shut behind her, the courtroom seemed to exhale, the air releasing months of grief and fear. Outside, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. But inside that small wooden room, the sound that lingered wasn't the noise of justice being served. It was the quiet weeping of a boy who had finally, painfully, survived the person he once loved. Winter returned to Maple Ridge before anyone realized how much time had passed. The Hayden house stood empty now, its windows dark, its walls stripped bare of photographs. The town had moved on the way small towns always do, slowly, reluctantly, leaving ghost trails of what once was. The mailbox still bore the family's name in faded paint. Someone left flowers there every month. No one ever saw who. Ethan didn't come back after the sentencing. He finished school quietly under a new district's care program, living with his brother Liam and their grandmother. The town that had once been home now felt like a wound that refused to close. He didn't speak to the press. He never sold his story. The only statement he ever made came years later, in a single line to a counselor who asked if he still thought about Amber. Every day, he said, but not the way she wanted. Because healing, he learned, wasn't about forgetting the monster. It was about remembering the victims. The laughter, the warmth, the small mercies that once filled the house before the night, it all went silent. Amber Kerrigan began her sentence at the State Correctional Facility for Women, her days reduced to grey routines. Lights on at 6, lights off at 9. She spent the first months writing letters no one answered. Eventually, even she stopped pretending there would be replies. Her name faded from headlines. The internet, always hungry for new tragedies, moved on. She became what she had always feared most: invisible. Detective Marquez retired 2 years later. When asked which case stayed with him, he didn't hesitate. "The Kerrigan girl," he said, "because she taught me something most cases don't, that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a child who's been told no." For the first time, the story of Amber Kerrigan and the Haydens became a cautionary echo in the community. The tale parents told their children about boundaries, about love that turns into ownership, about the danger of believing affection excuses harm. But for Ethan, it wasn't a story. It was the shape of his life, a scar carved into memory. Sometimes on quiet nights he'd play his guitar again, the same one he used to bring to the Haydens' living room, back when the world was simple and full of sound. He never sang, not anymore, but he'd play softly until the strings hummed like a heartbeat, and when the last note faded, the silence didn't feel like loss anymore. It felt like peace. The world never truly forgets stories like this. They linger, in court transcripts, in documentaries, in the whispered questions of people trying to understand how love becomes violence. But the truth is always the same. No matter how many times it's told, monsters are not born in darkness. They grow quietly in the light, in the moments we mistake control for care and obsession for love. And sometimes the scariest thing about evil is just how human it looks when it smiles.